My name's Hunter Cheney, and I'm one of the directors for the American Heritage Museum. Very excited to have Doug here to talk about these ships of World War II. Every time I think about this period, I'm always awestruck at our industrial capabilities in World War II. A good example of this, in addition to the ships, all manufacturing companies in World War II, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, everyone was invested in World War II, in the war effort. There was basically no civilian manufacturing, particularly in the car industry. And a good example as far as our industrial might, if you think of the B-24 Liberator, so this is a 4-engine heavy bomber of World War II. At the height of production in all of these converted Ford factories that Consolidated went in and converted these factories, at the height of production, you have one flying aircraft manufactured every hour. It's just incredible to think of the mechanisms and the infrastructure that's needed in order to achieve such a monumental number. And you see this across the board. When it comes to the ships, this is on a whole different level. A lot of metal and materials needed, and the number of people involved in constructing these ships was unique, definitely. Had it not been for our industrial isolation and our industrial might, the outcome of World War II would have been entirely different. When I think of the ships, of course, the first thing I think of is how dangerous it was for the ships to make that path, that trip across the Atlantic to the United Kingdom, to England, and to France. The dangers of U-boat attacks and ship attacks was constant for these ships going back and forth, supplying our allies. It was critical. The movement of these supplies was critical. So without further ado, please welcome Doug and talking about his book, Launching Liberty.
Thanks, Hunter. That's great. So I appreciate everyone coming out on a nice day today. One of the cool things about when you write a book and you do a little, I'll call it book tour, but when you travel around, is you get to go to places or see places that you've never been before. And I had never been here before. I knew about it, heard about it. But as I was finishing the book and thinking of places that I wanted to do events and reach out to, this was one of the places at the top of the list. And so now that I'm here and I'm sort of awestruck by sort of how cool it is, and it looks like it's one of these sort of hidden gems that exist in our midst that we sort of probably take for granted and don't appreciate. So it's really exciting for me to be here. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate the invitation. So as I talk about the book just published a couple weeks ago. So this is the beginning of me sort of rolling out and reaching audiences and talking to people about the Liberty ships of World War II. What I like to do at the beginning is tell a little story. So I'm going to tell you a story, which is this book was about a 5-year project for me, from start to finish. And the bulk of that work is research, reporting, just looking for documents, reading books, reading materials, reading World War II archives, tracking down letters, tracking down personal records of different people who were involved in the project. But it was about 3 years into the project where, one of the things that I realized was that I'm writing about something that I've never seen before. I've never, been up close with a Liberty ship before. And of course I knew that that was important to me. So there are 2 Liberty ships left in the country that are floating. One is in San Francisco Bay. It's called the SS Jeremiah O'Brien. And the other one is in Baltimore. And it's called the SS John W. Brown. So that was a relatively easy trip for me to make. And so I sort of got in the car with my teenage son, dropped him off at golf camp down in New Jersey for a couple of days, and then kept going to Baltimore. And I drove down to Baltimore. And it was an important trip for me to make. I was met there by a guy who was a retired firefighter who essentially was in charge of sort of the upkeep of the SS John W. Brown. And it's sort of like a floating museum at this point, if you want to think of it that way. So I drove down this gravelly road and near Baltimore, outside of downtown Baltimore, sort of just a deserted, sort of gravelly road, and park my car and sort of look up, and I'm like, okay, well, there's the Liberty Ship. And so I was struck by, a couple of things. First of all, I was struck by how long it was. So it's 441 feet. So when I started to do the math, I figured out it's about 100 feet longer than a football field. So if you just put that in perspective, 100 feet longer than a football field. But the other thing that I was really struck by was how deep it was. So Liberty ships were built, and I'll talk about this, with 5 cargo holds, 5 separate compartments, cargo holds, that carried, as Hunter said, Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy to our troops. One Liberty ship, a single Liberty ship, could carry 440 tanks. A single Liberty ship could carry 440 tanks. So think about that. So now imagine a fleet of Liberty ships. We built 2,710 of them in the war. So now you can sort of get a picture for how big they were. 440 tanks in a single Liberty ship. So I walked up the gangplank to step onto the ship, and I met with my guide for the day, and he took me around the ship, and we spent a couple hours really walking around the ship. It was cool to see the deck house where they slept, where they steered the ship from, all of that. But what I was really most interested in seeing was, in some ways, the most boring part of the ship, which is these giant, cavernous cargo holds. So we walked down a bunch of metal stairs into the bowels of the ship, and he took me into one of those cargo holds, the first one. And when I sort of found myself standing in that cargo hold, in some ways it's a space not unlike where we're sitting right now. I was struck by, first of all, how tall it was, just how high up the ceiling was. It was really deep. I'm standing on the floor of the ship essentially, and looking up, I was like, okay, I'm starting to picture this idea of tanks and jeeps and boxed up munitions and all the things that were necessary being lowered into this cargo hold. And I sort of stood there for a minute, and I tried to close my eyes and just appreciate for a moment that, nothing, of course, will ever take away from what the troops did in World War II, right? Nothing can take that away. But the troops needed help getting their supplies, getting their munitions, getting their tanks, their jeeps, their planes, all those things. The war was not fought on United States land. The war wasn't fought in New York City or in the plains of Kansas or in California. The war was fought across 2 gigantic oceans. And we had to find a way to get all of these supplies that FDR built in his wartime economy to our troops around the world. And that was sort of the purpose of the Liberty Ship, was to bring the arsenal of democracy to our troops. And as I stood there sort of in that giant cargo hold, and this was only one of the 5 cargo holds on the ship, I think I was sort of moved to think about how this is really where the war was won. It was won in these cargo holds because this is what the troops needed in order to fight the war. That's the things that were brought to them so they could do what they did. So I tell you that story just as a way of sort of reflection. If you're ever down in Baltimore, I would encourage you to go visit the John W. Brown. It's not on the top 10 list of tourist attractions in Baltimore by any means, nor is the one in San Francisco, but it is a piece of history that's been preserved, and it's just nice that they've been able to preserve it. And it was sort of powerful for me to sort of set foot on the Liberty Ship and walk around on it. Okay, so how were the Liberty Ships born? So even though it was an American ship built here in the United States, the roots of the Liberty Ship were actually British. The design for the ship was a British design. There was a shipbuilder in England by the name of Robert Cyril Thompson. He was a shipbuilder in the 1800s and the early 1900s who built ships and designed ships. the admiral, when World War II breaks out and the British Admiralty is in need of help, one of the things they've realized they were going to need, in addition to their world-class fleet of battleships and naval ships and all the things that they were going to need cargo ships. That was what they realized. All of their shipyards were completely occupied. They were being used to build the fighting ships, the things they needed to fight the Germans. They had gotten wind of this shipbuilder, Robert Thompson, and this design for a ship he built, and they invited him to come down to London, and they said to him, this ship that you have designed, we need those ships. We need a lot of them, but we can't build them here. We don't have the capacity. So they asked Robert Cyril Thompson if he would be willing to go to the United States, their closest ally. And again, this is 1940. The United States is not involved in the war yet. Pearl Harbor hasn't happened. This is not our fight. They asked Robert Thompson to go to the United States and see if he could essentially convince the U.S. to help build these cargo ships for the United Kingdom, for Great Britain. So he took a boat, got on a boat, and took a two-week trip over to the United States and met with some government officials at first. And they sent him to the United States with a budget. They said, here's the amount of money you're essentially allocated to spend to build these ships. They thought it was going to be a relatively easy process. The United States was their closest ally. FDR and Churchill were very close. They did not think this was going to be, that the United States was going to say, no, we're not going to help you. But they hadn't really thought through what was going on in the United States at the time, because the United States, even though we were not in the war, essentially had the same problem that they had in Great Britain. All of our shipyards were at capacity. They were being used to really upgrade, update, and rebuild our naval ships. And there was really no capacity to suddenly say, oh, okay, well, we'll stop building these American naval ships to build the Britain cargo ships. That wasn't going to happen. That was not as important as it was to Great Britain and as close of an ally as they were. That was not our biggest priority. But what they told Robert Cyril Thompson was, you are more than welcome to go around the United States, meet with the shipyard owners, meet with businessmen, do whatever you want to do. And if you can find perhaps a dormant shipyard, maybe a shipyard that's been not in use, or maybe an old shipyard that's sitting and needs to be rebuilt, or maybe you find a businessman who's got land and they'll build you a new shipyard. All those options were certainly on the table for him. But they couldn't use an existing American shipyard in order to build these ships. That changed the equation for Robert Cyril Thompson. He suddenly realized, well, first of all, the amount of money that I was given and allocated to spend was not going to be nearly enough. He was given money just to build ships. He thought the United States was going to say, here you go, here's our shipyards, here's our shipbuilders, we'll build the ships for you. That wasn't the case. Suddenly he was going to have to build a shipyard first before he could even start about building ships. Then he was going to have to figure out who are the builders, where are they going to come from, and who's going to pay for them, and then the materials to build the ships. So the amount of money that was going to be needed was dramatically different. He goes on a 17,000-mile, 3-week barnstorming trip around the country. He visits Seattle, Tacoma, Los Angeles, North Carolina, Mobile, Alabama, New Orleans, Houston. Goes all over, visiting shipyards and shipyard managers. And eventually, I'm sort of abbreviating the story a little bit, eventually he comes in contact with a guy in Seattle who sort of impresses him a little bit, but he doesn't really understand what his role is in the Seattle shipbuilding operation. He just strikes him as a businessman, and he promises Thompson, I'll build you 200 Liberty ships. Thompson was only asking for 60. He said, we need 60 cargo ships. But this businessman said, I'll build you 200. He comes back to Washington, and back there he is sort of told that, like, the man you met with runs an operation out in Seattle who is already doing a shipbuilding contract for the United States government. And in fact, it's going pretty well. They seem to be ahead of budget, they seem to be under budget and ahead of schedule, and sort of gave him the encouragement that that might be a good operation to work with. So Thompson agrees that this man he'd met, whose name was Henry Kaiser, I'm going to talk to you about Henry Kaiser in a minute, Henry Kaiser was probably a good partner to help build these ships. The agreement was made that they were going to build 60 ships to start, 30 in Richmond, California, near San Francisco, and then they were going to have to find a partner on the East Coast, because they did not want to build all the ships on the West Coast, to build 30 on the East Coast. And that would eventually become Portland, Maine, and Bath Shipbuilding, and Pete Newell, a guy up there in Maine who convinced them that he was the East Coast partner. So this contract is signed. Thompson, realizing that the amount of money that he had been told he could spend was not nearly enough, he writes a cable back to the Admiralty and says, I've got a partner, I've got a deal, we're ready to go, sends this cable, but then realizes this cable is going to be received and they're going to be like, you're out of your mind. Like, we told you could spend this and you're asking us for 10 times the amount of money that we had told you could spend. He realizes he needs to go back in person and essentially tell them the story in person. He gets on a boat in late December of 1940, and the boat that he's taking back to England gets torpedoed, and it is essentially sunk. He survives, gets on a lifeboat along with some other members of the crew, although people did die in the torpedo of the ship. And he eventually gets rescued, gets back to England. His papers, he had kept a briefcase the whole time that had his papers, was soggy and drenched and wet. But he makes it back to England and convinces the Admiralty to move forward with the plan. That's how the Liberty ships were born, because that design that he had brought to the United States essentially is a ship that has 5 cargo holds and is a gigantic, deep ship with a lot of space to carry a lot of stuff. And that design is called the Ocean Class ship. That's what the United States helped build for the British so that they could fight the Germans. It's called the Ocean Class ship. About 3 weeks later, January now of 1941, President Roosevelt wheels himself into the White House executive room and announced that the United States is also going to get into the shipbuilding business for cargo ships, and announces that they're going to build 200 cargo ships for the United States. And that was sort of piggybacking on the British deal to launch the United States into the cargo shipbuilding business. 9 shipyards around the country were selected to build these ships. So now I want to talk for a minute about Henry Kaiser. If I say the name Henry Kaiser to you, I'm going to guess that what's the first thing you think of? Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente Healthcare. So indeed, that is the same Henry Kaiser. Henry Kaiser was born in 1882, months apart from President Roosevelt, in upstate New York, just like President Roosevelt. So they were born just a couple hundred miles apart from each other in the same year, and just a couple months apart. But they never met until 50 years later. Henry Kaiser eventually settled himself out in the West Coast and became a contractor. He was building roads and bridges, things like that. He was a West Coast contractor, and he became known as a guy who got the job done, even if he wasn't an expert in anything. He was a businessman, and he sort of took the approach whenever he got a contract of, I can build anything if you give me the right people and the right managers and give them the right tools, we can do anything. Even if he didn't know how to do it, he would find the right people to do it. He won a huge contract to rebuild an entire road system in Cuba. It was one of the biggest projects he did that really put him on the map. And this project was sort of done under budget. It took 2 years. It was a huge project of rebuilding some roads in Cuba. So Henry Kaiser, sort of in the, I would say, late 1920s, early 1930s, the Depression has now hit in the early 1930s. The United States government is trying to figure out projects and ways to start to rebuild the economy. One of the projects they put out for bid is a hydroelectric dam in the desert in the West. It becomes the Boulder Dam, later to be known as the Hoover Dam. That project goes up for bid, and Henry Kaiser, who up until this point is really not widely known. He's certainly not known on the East Coast. He's just built a bunch of roads and bridges on the West Coast. He puts together a conglomerate of businessmen, and they bid on the Hoover Dam project, and they win it. And this is the biggest government project that's ever been sort of put out for bid like that. That project is finished. Henry Kaiser, with his leadership, they finished that project under budget by millions of dollars and 2 years ahead of schedule, which is a lot. President Roosevelt comes out to celebrate the opening of the dam in 1935. Roosevelt and Kaiser, for the first time, cross paths. And this is an important time because what happens is, you have to remember now, mid-1930s, the American economy is starting to slowly come back from the Depression. But Roosevelt needs any help he can get to create jobs, to create excitement, to create energy. He's trying to bring the country back. He sees this guy, Henry Kaiser. He doesn't really know a lot about him, but he's impressed by him. He got this project done under budget, ahead of schedule. It's a massive project. Required, literally building this dam in the middle of the desert. Just a crazy project. He realizes a guy like Henry Kaiser might be a valuable person to have around and to sort of befriend. And if you look from the other perspective, Henry Kaiser is a little different from the other Henry of the day, Henry Ford. Henry Ford was known as an inventor, an innovator, a very creative thinker. That was not Henry Kaiser. Henry Kaiser was a businessman, a government contractor. Everything he did relied on the government providing a job, him winning the job, and doing the work. He, having a friend like the President of the United States in his pocket, that could be a good friend to have. He needs government contracts in order for his business to succeed. The two men, Kaiser and FDR, really recognize how they can be beneficial to each other. And in fact, years later, in the early 1940s, when FDR is thinking of running again for president, Kaiser's name is floated as his vice president. That's how popular Henry Kaiser eventually became. He was considered as a vice president candidate. He did not happen, but he was that popular at the time. Okay, the two of them come together. They realize they start to work together on other projects. War breaks out in Europe, late 1930s. FDR starts his Arsenal of Democracy, a term we're all familiar with now. And he recognizes that, as I said at the beginning, we're going to have to figure out a way to bring all of these materials that we're building, this wartime economy, we're going to have to bring that overseas. A decision that he made in this process is one I just want to talk about for a minute. It's an important sort of political decision that I've often asked myself, if we could build the Liberty ships today, would a leader be able to do what President Roosevelt did? He recognized that the type of ship he needed in order to sustain the troops in the war was not going to be the fastest ship, the prettiest ship, the best ship, the biggest ship. That's not what he needed. He just needed a lot of ships. And it required him to sort of set his ego aside for a minute and not try to build any of those other things, fastest, busiest, biggest, prettiest, most beautiful, fastest, any of those things. He told his team, his people, I just need a lot of ships and I need them fast, I need them now. That was a big decision for a president to make. And that's why the ships became known to a lot of people as the ugly ducklings, because they were not pretty ships. They were workhorses. They were just steel tanks, essentially. That decision was sort of a monumental, decision for the president to make, because it allowed the process of building Liberty ships to sort of proceed without focusing on the design or little elements that might have slowed the process down. Instead, they came up with one design, a template, and they essentially, think of it as a chocolate chip cookie recipe that was sent to 9 shipyards around the country. And they were all told, build this ship. That's it. That's the only ship we want you to build. Just like the design says. And so that was a big part of the process, to sort of create this design to build just that ship. The ship, at the beginning of the process, and this is the last thing I want to talk about, the speed of these ships. At the beginning of the process, a Liberty ship took about 8 months to build. That was far too long. 8 months to build one ship. As they started to get better and better, I think I have a chart. I had a chart. I lost it. But I know the numbers. The early days of the Liberty ship program, in the first month, okay, they built 2 or 3 Liberty ships across the country. That's how many ships in the first month of the program. By March or April, 26 ships were finished in 1 month. By July, 50 Liberty ships were finished in 1 month. So from 3 to 26 to 53 in 1 month now I'm talking about. Eventually, by the end of 1942, 80 to 90 ships were being built in a month. The peak came in mid-1943 when 120 Liberty ships were built in 1 month. And overall, as I mentioned at the beginning, 2,710 Liberty ships were built over the course from essentially January 1941 to the end of the war. 2,710. It's a remarkable number if you think about how many ships they built in such a short amount of time. One of the ways they were able to do it, the most important way, was essentially by stealing a page out of Henry Ford's book. Early in the Liberty ship process, Henry Kaiser was sort of recognizing that we need to build these ships faster. How do we do that? How do we get these things cranked out faster? He looked to Detroit and said, well, how is Henry Ford pumping out 40,000 vehicles a month? 40,000 vehicles a month. How is he doing that? He sent one of his most loyal employees up to Detroit to inspect and to sort of get a tour of the Detroit facilities. And what he saw was the assembly line process that Henry Ford had really perfected and modified to work. Assembly lines where a car, a 15-foot Model T, rolls down an assembly line, and different workers then pick it up and work at different parts. That was great for a vehicle, right? That worked fine for a car. A little different to try to roll a 441-foot ship down an assembly line. Not so easy. But what Henry Kaiser recognized, and he stole a page out of the Henry Ford model, was that different parts of the ship could be built in different places. So instead of simply building the ship from the hull up, right, laying the hull and then just building it up like this, all in one place on the water essentially, or on the shipway, instead of that, they could have the hull being worked on by a group of workers, while at the same time, hundreds of other workers were over here building the deck house. And hundreds of other workers were over here building a different part of the ship. And they set up different sort of warehouse-like areas in the shipyards where pieces of the ship could all be built together. The analogy I like to use is at some point you've probably all opened a Lego package. And inside that Lego package, you'll have different bags of parts, right? So there's a bag here, bag here, bag here. So it's one thing if your kid tried to build that Lego by just dumping all those bags out on the floor into one gigantic pile and then build this project. That's one way to do it. But imagine if he had other friends who came over and they each took a bag and they went to their corner of the room. So this group of friends built that bag and this group of friends built that bag. And then together they brought those pieces together and boom, suddenly the ship pops into place. Think of how much faster the project would go if they did it that way. That's essentially how the Liberty ships were built. Different components were built in different locations, and then they were all brought together. In the summer of 1942, so Pearl Harbor is now 6 months behind us, the war is raging, Henry Kaiser decides, I need to speed up production. And I also want to sort of inspire America. He pits his 2 shipyards in a competition against each other. And he says, you're now racing to see who can build the fastest Liberty ship. It sort of is done as almost like an athletic competition, if you want to think of it that way. And the workers at each of these 2 shipyards, one is in Portland, Oregon, and the other one is in Richmond, California. It sort of pits them against each other, and they really take it to heart. They see it as a competition. Now, I want to be clear, there was a little cheating involved because, again, the ships were being prefabricated. So when I say that a ship was built in X number of days, that means it was put together in X number of days, but some of it was already built in those prefabricated parts. Nonetheless, the first ship in the race to see who could build the fastest ship came together in 26 days. 26 days to build one Liberty ship. It launches from Portland, And then Richmond says, we can beat that. We'll do it in 18 days. They built a ship in 18 days. And then Portland says, we'll beat 18 days. And they built a ship in 10 days. 10 days to build one Liberty ship to come together. When they finished that ship, everybody sort of thought like, that's it. Race is over. 10 days. The Richmond workers said, as I like to say, hold my beer. Hang on a minute. They pulled together all the best ideas from all the shipyard workers. How can we cut a few hours here? How can we cut a few hours here? How can we cut a day here? They compiled a whole bunch of ideas, and they set about to build the fastest Liberty ship. And they finished building the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. So, again, a little bit of cheating, because some of that ship was prefabricated, but that's how long it took to essentially, it worked 24 hours, 7 days, around the clock, nonstop to do this in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. And as someone asked me once, did it sail? Yes, it sailed. Mm-hmm. It sailed really well for 2 years in the war and carried out a lot of really important missions. So that race, that ship was sort of known as a stunt ship, if you want to think of it that way. No one expected them to keep building ships in 4 days. That was not realistic. But it was done in a way to motivate and inspire and sort of lift up the nation. There were headlines around the country. Kaiser Shipyard launches a ship in 4 days. So it really was seen around the country as this incredible effort to see how quickly Americans could come together, show their patriotism, and do this incredible thing. So that's sort of the story in a nutshell of how the Liberty ships came to be. I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute and a video as well, just a short video. But one of the reasons I like to talk about the Liberty ships and to just take questions and what have you is when I was researching this book, and when you're researching World War II, there have been thousands of books written about World War II, and I knew that going into this project. And one of the challenges that you find when you're researching World War II is something original, or something that you feel like, I haven't really read that story. And there are a lot of stories about World War II out there. And that was what drew me to this story, is I feel like I hadn't, even though I knew and I heard the term Liberty ships, I certainly knew a little bit about them, hadn't really read the backstory on how they came to be. And like I said, I really grew and gained an appreciation for the role, the important and historic role they played in the war. I really sort of came to appreciate just that the war turns out very differently without these 2,700 ships. Our troops needed them in order to fight. And I feel it was an underappreciated, sort of undertold story about the war. I didn't get to talk too much about the workers. A big part of the story is about the workers who came together to build these ships. They came from all across the country to these shipyards. They dropped everything: plumbers, PhDs, engineers, electricians, housewives. They all came together to do this. One of the interesting findings from the war was that, we've all heard the term Rosie the Riveter. One of the things about the Liberty ships was that the ships were not riveted together. They were welded together. That's how they were built. In the process of welding a ship together, one of the discoveries that was made pretty quickly is that welding, if you've ever welded something or seen a welder, requires sort of a certain dexterity with your arms to reach into corners and to sort of like reach up and down and different angles. And one of the things that was discovered is that women were actually better at welding than men, because their arms were skinnier and they could reach into corners and tight spaces, and they could sort of do the work differently and even more efficiently than men could. And so the term Wendy the Welder was actually born in the war. And I sort of refer to Wendy the Welder as a cousin of Rosie the Riveter, because they played a critical part. The women who built these ships and who participated in the shipyards played such a critical part, and I tell a lot of their stories in the book. It was just an important sort of role that I didn't know a lot about. But there were welding competitions around the country. Women were participating in races to see who could be the fastest welder. And they got invited to the White House to meet with Eleanor Roosevelt. So it was sort of an exciting part of the shipbuilding process. So let me show you a couple of pictures real quick. I lost my screen here just by not. This is Robert Cyril Thompson on the left. There were not many photos of him, but that's the British ship designer who came across and whose design was used to build the ship. On the right, I didn't get to talk about him, that's William Francis Gibbs. He was America's sort of preeminent ship designer. He was the one responsible for taking Thompson's design and essentially Americanizing it. If you think about it, Thompson designed a British ship, which meant British measurements, for British tools, for British shipbuilders. But the ships were going to be built here. So we needed someone to take that design, those instructions, all those things, and redo it for American shipyards with American tools, American measurements, all those things. So that's what Gibbs did. He was a cantankerous, grumpy guy who loved to design his own ships. He did not love this project because essentially it wasn't his ship. It was someone else's ship, and he was just being asked to do the grunt work of modifying it. But he did it. This is just a picture of Henry Kaiser and FDR. So their friendship became really important. That's Kaiser in the backseat and FDR in the car. Their friendship became really, really important to this project. I mentioned Maine because it's obviously a big part of New England and its role in the Liberty ship. This is Pete Newell. He owned the shipyard up in Maine that essentially became really the second or third biggest Liberty shipbuilder in the country, behind Richmond and Portland, Oregon. Maine was a huge, huge player in the Liberty ship project. So this is just for an overview of the Richmond, California shipyard, which was the first one to cross the bay from San Francisco. It was a massive, sprawling operation. The town of Richmond, California, just to give you an idea, had about 24,000 people in it before the war. The Liberty shipyard, when it opened, essentially the population of Richmond, California quadrupled to more than 100,000 people. And this town was really overrun with workers, and the economy was dramatically changed. Schools, imagine what happened if a town of 25,000 people suddenly had 100,000 people. The schools were overrun with so many children. The teachers found themselves overwhelmed, but it was just a part of the war that had to happen. This is some of the propaganda and marketing materials that were used to recruit workers. Like I said, women were critical and played a pivotal role in the war. And so these are some of the things that you saw out there. This is just an illustration I had done for the book. It actually appears in the book by a local artist, a friend of mine, Joe McKendry, just to sort of show you what a Liberty ship looked like. So you can see the 5 cargo holds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, down below. And just the ships were bare bones. They were very, very lightly armed. They did not, when they went on the water at 11, 12 knots, they were incredibly vulnerable to attack. They traveled in convoys, but they were really vulnerable to attack because they were lightly armed ships. So when a German battleship or German raider would see a Liberty ship on the open water, they licked their chops. They just thought that's easy pickings for us to take out because they knew it was wasn't fast, couldn't run away from their torpedoes, and also couldn't really fight back. So that was one of the reasons why the whole essence of the program was we have to build ships faster than the Germans can sink them. That was literally what the whole point of the program was.
How many get sunk?
So I've never been able to identify a specific number. It was in the hundreds, I know that. A lot of them sort of just got torpedoed, sunk, the crews were rescued. But it's not as many as someone might think. Like of the 2,700 that were built, most of them made their journeys. So this is just sort of some pictures from the shipyards, what they look like, how quickly they came together. This is sort of like the deck of a ship coming together, scaffolding all around, just, workers working all around. I talked about the race to build them faster and faster. The launchings became a big ceremony. When a ship was finished, the launching became a big ceremony. A dignitary was usually invited to christen the ship, the name, and christen it and splash a bottle of champagne and launch it into the water. One of the things I didn't talk about, sort of getting into the weeds a little bit, but when a ship was launched, that didn't mean it immediately went into the war. Weeks, sometimes months had to be spent to sort of do the finishing touches, finish the electricity and the plumbing and all those things. So it was sort of put in a different place, but the purpose of getting it out was to free this space up so another ship could start. They didn't want to leave a ship here just to do the final finishing touches. That was too slow. It slowed the process down. So they would launch it, bring it over to a different spot to finish the finishing touches, and then it would be put into battle. And let me show you this video real quick, and then I'll just take a couple questions. This is just a little trailer that I put together, that I put out there. I think it'll play. Will it play? Let me see. In the early days of World War II, before Pearl Harbor pulled America into the fighting, our nation's fleet of cargo ships was tired, most of them relics from the First World War. Great Britain desperately needed more ships and asked America for help. The two nations struck a deal to build 60 British ships. It inspired President Roosevelt to launch his own emergency shipbuilding program, and with the help of the industrialist Henry J. Kaiser, they would build the Liberty Fleet.
This is a memorable day in the history of American shipbuilding.
These welded steel Liberty ships stretched 441 feet, longer than a football field. But the first ones took half a year to build, far too long.
This whole nation is becoming one great fighting force.
Hundreds of thousands of men and women had to be trained in shipbuilding. And women became the most important shipbuilders. They became known as Wendy the Welder.
We must build more cargo ships, still more cargo ships, until we achieve a launching each day.
The Liberty ship became the symbol of what Americans were capable of when their freedom and democracy were at stake. The fastest Liberty ship was built in 4 days and 15 hours. In 3 years, America built 2,710 Liberty ships. The war would have been lost without them. So that's it. Thanks for your attention, the time, and I'm happy to answer a few questions if you've got them.
I do.
Things I didn't get to talk about that you were hoping I would talk about or anything like that.
How big a crew did a Liberty ship carry?
Good question. About 40 merchant marines typically sailed on a Liberty ship with an additional dozen or so Navy personnel accompanying them, but somewhere in that vicinity on most of them. In the back and then here.
And what is the difference of the length of a Liberty ship and like the USS Carl Vinson?
So the best example I can give you is, well, just because it was an old ship that we're all familiar with, the Titanic. It's about half the length of the Titanic. The Titanic was somewhere in the vicinity of 800 feet. This was 440 feet. I said it was about 100 feet longer than a football field. So it's a huge ship, but it wasn't like the biggest ship. It was just a very big ship, but with these huge cargo holds was the biggest feature.
Did they ever make them out of wood?
What's that?
Did they ever make them out of wood?
Nope, steel.
And what was the deflection from the front to the back in the ocean, in the rough water?
What do you mean?
In other words, is there a deflection? Was there a deflection there?
No, first of all, they were welded steel ships. And they were, from what I've read, people who sailed on them, and I've read a lot of records of people who sailed on them, they were so weighted down with cargo that they generally were pretty smooth on the water because they were just so heavy, 10,000 tons, on the water. So they were just so heavy that they really did not have any issues in terms of that. One of the things that I saw when I visited the ship that I was struck by is there's on the side of the ship, and the image on the cover shows this, has these numbers 1 through 30, which is indicating how deep into the water the hull is sinking. So when I saw the ship in Baltimore, and this ship here is an example, pretty much all 30 numbers were visible, but when a ship was loaded with all of its cargo, the 30 essentially was underwater. So it just showed you how deep they sunk in the water with their massive cargo. Go ahead.
Two questions. Are you related to Johnny Most?
I am not. I used to have a sign outside my office that said, Doug, no relation to Johnny Most.
The other thing is, I remember reading somewhere, I forget where, that there was a design flaw in Liberty ships, which rendered them vulnerable to a lot of things.
Right.
Who figured it out and how to fix it and what happened?
So the flaw was that some ships later in the program cracked. There was some cracking in the hulls of the ships. It was not considered, they really studied it to figure out what was causing the cracks. There were some findings that it was related to the welding and how the welding was done. Some of it was insufficient steel, and the steel may have not been as high quality as they needed. In the end, what eventually happened after the Liberty Ship program was well underway, they modified the design and they built what are called the Victory ships. And the Victory ship was a slightly modified version of the Victory ship. The Victory ship was a slightly modified version of the Liberty ship. A few feet longer, actually went a little bit faster, different motor, and it was just built a tiny bit differently. And they built roughly 400 plus Victory ships toward the end of the war when the Liberty ship was sort of phased out.
I'll follow up. On the Titanic, they did a study about 15 years ago, and it showed that the quality of steel was inconsistent.
Right.
And that was one of the reasons why it collapsed so quickly.
Right.
Was that the same issue?
Yeah, I think inconsistent is a good word. I think inefficient, or sort of just, the steel was coming from all parts of the country. And so I think they just found that some of the steel was not all the exact same strength and same quality. So again, there were 9 shipyards, and the steel was coming from different places, and it was not always perfect. And so that was one of the findings, that the steel was part of the problem. Yep.
What was the power plant? What were the motors?
The motors were reciprocating engines, so they were these up and down sort of like movements that powered them. It was one motor. The guy whose name was Charlie Moore, who built this motor, and that was the motor that essentially was built a lot fast to essentially be sent to all these shipyards to power these ships. So it was a reciprocating engine. The ships, like I said, were slow, 11, 12 knots they went, which was really not fast at all. But again, it was like, how can we find an engine that can be built quickly, that can attach to these ships really quickly, and get them out and move on to the next one? So the engine was a big component of the ship that had to be replicated quickly. But it was, what's that?
Steam, right?
Yes.
I have a question. We move cargo with containers and today, and there was a transition from open cargo ships, like a Liberty ship,
Right.
to that. And I remember they'd have gangs going out of the Longshoremen's Hall in Commonwealth here in Boston.
Yep.
And when they had a lot of ships there, right, you'd be able to go down there, and after they had all the regular gangs, they call them gangs, you could go out and unload it. It was mostly open cargo.
Okay.
So I think I was told that, some of the ships that we unloaded were still Liberty ships, and we're talking like 1970.
That seems unlikely. As far as I know, all the Liberty ships were scrapped for metal in the 60s. So someone asked me that question once before, and I just wanted to be ready, so I looked it up. And yeah, so most of the Liberty ships, once they were finished with the war, they were used for a little bit longer in the 50s, but they were eventually scrapped for their metal and finished with. One, weirdly enough, was used as a public school in New York City for a number of years. And like I said, a couple of them remain as floating museums, but for the most part, the Liberty ships are at the bottom of the ocean or scrapped for sale.
Who were they named for?
Good question. Everybody. So there was a naming process, and I talk about it in the book. There was one woman, her name was Eleanor Kunitz, who was sort of put in charge of naming the ships. Submissions came from around the country. School children were invited to participate. And they were named for men, for women, for heroes, for poets, for artists, for politicians, for everybody. You had to be dead. That was one of the rules to get a Liberty ship named after you. But you can imagine that, there were a lot of names that were submitted, and it was really sort of a wide-ranging group of people who had Liberty ships named after them. But it was an important ship, and researching the book was just so interesting for me. I was able to stumble into so many great stories about people who sailed on them during the war, worked on them. I didn't tell you the story. Really briefly, I'll just tell you that when you're researching World War II, at this point in time, if you're hoping to find someone who worked on a Liberty ship, as I was, do the math. It was not in my favor. If you to work on a Liberty ship in, say, 1942, let's say he was 20 years old, and I'm being generous because that's young, and shipbuilders were generally a little older than that. That means he would have been born in, say, 1922, which is roughly when I was researching this book, which means they're 100 years old. So I did a lot of research trying to find anyone who might have worked on a Liberty ship. Every time, not to be morbid, but every time I would find a name from an article there was a story about someone who worked on a Liberty ship or whatever, I would immediately search obituary files to see if they were still alive. And very often I found an obituary and I was like, okay, move on. In 2023, I was researching something and I stumbled onto an article up in Maine about a man and a woman who had just celebrated their 100th birthday at a restaurant. And the story in the Maine newspaper talked about how they both had worked in the Liberty shipyard up in Portland, Maine. So this was 2023. I immediately searched to see if I could find if they were still alive, and I didn't seem to find any obituaries. I tracked down his daughter's name in Maine and sent her an email. And she wrote me back the next day and said, my mom has passed, but my dad is still here. And he is sharp as a tack. His hearing is a little shot, but he has incredible memories of working in the shipyard. He'd be happy to talk to you. I sort of said to her, like, can I come up tomorrow? And she said he's 102. I made plans to go visit them about 2 weeks later, and it was for me, it was a very sort of moving interview. I sat with him in his kitchen. His name is Arthur Babineau. I interviewed him about his time working on the Liberty ships. It was powerful for me. He was really the only one I found who had worked on them. Again, he was 102. I was grateful that I got that moment with him. I spent an afternoon with him. He did have great memories. He covers about 1.5 pages in the book where I'm able to sort of tell his story. I'm grateful to his daughter for allowing me to come up. So it was a nice moment for me to have that, because there just aren't many of them left. So I was glad I was able to do that. But again, I was drawn to the fact that I felt like this was an underappreciated little slice of World War II that hadn't been told. And when you're writing about World War II, one of the biggest challenges is, I use the term rabbit hole. Every time you stumble into something, you can't go down that rabbit hole, because 9 times out of 10, that's been covered by a book, by a famous writer, by something. And so I really had to be disciplined and focused and just constantly remind myself that I kept telling myself, I'm not writing a World War II book, I'm writing a book about Liberty ships, and there's a difference. And that was sort of just focus on what my story is about. And in terms of why I was drawn to it, it was really, I think as a reporter and a researcher and a writer, I'm drawn to stories about people. I like writing about people. And then when you add in people doing interesting things, building interesting things, doing interesting things, I'm drawn to that. So I think people like to read about people, and certainly World War II seems to have endless fascination and interest. But that's where I start. I start with like a story rooted in people, and then the history element.